Dr. Elias Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead as he knelt before an ancient stone tablet covered in intricate alien inscriptions. The dense jungle that surrounded the ruins of the Zalari's ancestral city buzzed with the sounds of distant creatures, their calls reverberating against the weathered stone walls. Despite the humidity and the overwhelming weight of the mission, he felt exhilaration surge through his veins. This was what he lived for, deciphering lost languages, uncovering the secrets of the past, piecing together civilizations that had long faded into dust. The research expedition had been underway for nearly 2 months, and though progress had been slow, it had been steady. The Zalari, a race of tall, blue-skinned beings with luminous silver eyes and delicate, bioluminescent patterns along their arms and necks, were hesitant to allow outsiders access to their sacred ruins. The site was believed to be the last resting place of their ancient ancestors, a once mighty civilization that had mysteriously vanished thousands of years ago. To them, the old language inscribed upon the walls was sacred, an echo of a time they barely understood. Elias had spent years studying linguistic structures across various alien species, fascinated by how language evolved across different planets and cultures. The Zalari's ancestral tongue, however, was unlike anything he had encountered before. It was complex, filled with layered meanings, symbols interwoven with phonetic sounds in a way that made translation a near impossible feat. Yet something about it nagged at him, a strange sense of familiarity that he couldn't shake. He leaned in closer, tracing the engraved symbols with his fingertips, feeling the indentations beneath his touch. His voice, hushed yet firm, broke the silence as he spoke a phrase he had been attempting to decode for weeks. "Jola Renai Vesk Tuon." The moment the words left his lips, a sharp gasp pierced the air behind him. Elias turned abruptly, his gaze locking onto Liara, the young Zalari researcher who had been observing him from a short distance away. Her luminous silver eyes had widened in shock, her dark blue skin paling slightly as she took an unsteady step forward. You spoke the words," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Elias frowned, confused by her reaction. "I was just testing a possible pronunciation. Did I say something wrong?" She shook her head rapidly, her bioluminescent markings pulsing faintly. A clear sign of emotional distress among her people. "No, you didn't say something wrong. You said it perfectly." His stomach tightened at her words. Perfectly? He had expected her to correct his pronunciation, perhaps to tell him that he was close but not quite right. Instead, she was staring at him as though he had just resurrected a ghost before her very eyes. Liara stepped closer, her fingers trembling slightly as she reached out and pointed to the tablet. "Say it again," she urged. Elias hesitated, but the intensity in her gaze made him comply. "Jola Renai Vesk Tuon." A shudder passed through her, and she let out a sharp breath. "This language, it was lost," she murmured. "No living Zalari speaks it. No one has for thousands of years. It was the tongue of our ancestors, the words of the gods. We only know fragments from inscriptions, yet you spoke it as if it were your own." Elias stared at her, his mind struggling to process what she was saying. It wasn't unusual for linguists to reconstruct lost languages, to piece together sounds and meanings from fragmented texts. But the way she was reacting made it clear that this was something far beyond simple linguistic reconstruction. "How could I have spoken it correctly if no one alive knows how it sounds?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Liara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned, her long cloak swirling around her ankles as she strode toward a carved stone pillar at the center of the ruin. She placed a hand against it, her fingers pressing into a set of faded markings. "This phrase," she said, her voice steadying, "is part of a sacred text. It means, 'The stars remember the ones who walked before us.' It is one of the few phrases we still understand because it has been passed down through ritual and song. The rest of the language is gone. No one knows how it was spoken. No one knows the full meaning of these inscriptions." Erelus felt his pulse quicken. If what she was saying was true, then he had spoken words that should have been impossible for him to know. He took a slow step toward the pillar, scanning the inscriptions with renewed focus. His mind reeled, trying to recall where he had heard these sounds before. Was it some subconscious association? A distant memory from an old Earth language? "Are you certain that no one else knows this language?" he asked. "No historians, no scholars?" Liara shook her head. "Only the gods knew how to speak it, or so we believed." Elias exhaled sharply. He had encountered many myths and legends throughout his work, but never had he stumbled into one so deeply ingrained in a species' culture. If the Zelleri believed this was a divine language, then the fact that he had spoken it would not be taken lightly. "Then we need to figure out why I know it," he said, more to himself than to her. Liara studied him for a long moment, her gaze filled with uncertainty. Then, without another word, she turned and motioned for him to follow. "You must come with me," she said. "The elders need to hear this." Elias hesitated. He had spent enough time around Zelleri culture to know that their elders were not to be disturbed without reason. They held immense power, both politically and spiritually. If he spoke to them about this discovery, it would not be a simple academic discussion. It could change the way the Zelleri saw their own history. But he also knew he couldn't ignore this. Swallowing his apprehension, he nodded. "Lead the way." As he followed Liara through the ruins, his mind raced. What had he just uncovered? And more importantly, how could he possibly know the lost words of a civilization that had vanished long before humanity had even taken its first steps among the stars? Elias followed Liara through the dense jungle that surrounded the ruins, his mind still reeling from what had just happened. She moved quickly, her steps precise as she navigated the narrow, moss-covered paths that wound between towering stone pillars and broken statues. He struggled to keep up, the thick roots snaking across the ground forcing him to watch his footing. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth, and the distant hum of nocturnal creatures echoed through the trees. Neither of them spoke as they moved. Elias had too many questions, but he sensed that now was not the time to ask them. Liara's posture was tense, her bioluminescent markings pulsing faintly in irregular patterns. She was deep in thought, likely trying to figure out how to explain what had happened to the elders. The village came into view as they emerged from the jungle. It was a sprawling settlement built around a massive, ancient tree with luminescent blue leaves. The roots extended in every direction, some of them forming natural archways over the stone pathways that crisscrossed the village. The Zelari homes were carved directly into the cliffsides, their entrances decorated with glowing symbols that Elias could not yet read. Fires flickered in suspended lanterns, casting elongated shadows across the settlement. Liara led him past the main square, where several Zelari paused to watch them. Their silver eyes followed his every step, some of them whispering among themselves. He knew he was an outsider, but tonight something had changed. He wasn't just a visitor anymore. He was something else. They reached the base of the great tree, where an arched doorway led into its hollowed trunk. The council chamber was housed within, its walls reinforced with stone and metal, its interior lined with relics of the past. As Liara entered, she didn't wait for permission. She strode forward, her voice steady but urgent. "We must speak," she announced. The elders were already gathered. 5 of them sat in a semicircle around a raised stone platform, their robes draped in ceremonial markings that denoted their status. Their expressions were unreadable, their luminous eyes reflecting the firelight. The eldest among them, a Zelleri named Varash, turned his gaze toward Elias. "You enter our chambers with urgency," Varash said, his voice deep and resonant. "Speak your reason." Liara exhaled slowly, then looked toward Elias. He realized she wanted him to be the one to explain. He swallowed his hesitation and stepped forward. "I was studying the inscriptions in the ruins," Elias began. "While testing possible pronunciations, I spoke a phrase aloud. Liara recognized it immediately as part of your lost ancestral language. She said I spoke it perfectly. Varash's gaze did not waver. And how do you explain this, human? Levias hesitated. I can't, he admitted. I have been studying your language for months, but I should not have been able to pronounce something perfectly when there are no records of how it was spoken. I don't understand how I knew it. One of the other elders, a woman named Suron, narrowed her eyes. The language of our ancestors is sacred, she said. It was lost long ago, taken by time and tragedy. No living Silari speaks it. And yet, you claim to have spoken it as though it were natural to you? I don't claim anything, Elias replied. Liara heard it, and she reacted the way she did because she knew what it meant. I have no explanation for this. The chamber was silent for a long moment. Then Varash rose from his seat and stepped forward. He studied Elias carefully, his eyes betraying no emotion. Then he turned toward Liara. You are certain of what you heard? He asked. She nodded without hesitation. I would not bring him here if I were not. Varash exchanged glances with the other elders, then motioned toward the back of the chamber. A large stone door was embedded in the far wall, covered in ancient symbols. 2 guards stood before it, their expressions stoic. Bring him to the vault, Varash ordered. Elias stiffened. He had heard of the vault before. It was a place no outsider had ever been allowed to enter. The Zelari spoke of it in hushed voices, a sacred chamber containing relics of their ancestors, artifacts that predated their recorded history. Liara looked at him, her expression unreadable, before nodding to Varash. I will take him. The guard stepped aside as the massive stone door groaned open, revealing a narrow passageway that led downward. The air inside was cool, carrying the scent of aged stone and something else, something ancient. Elias stepped inside, Liara close behind him. The torches lining the walls cast flickering shadows across the passage as they descended. His heart pounded in his chest. He had come to study the past, but now he felt as if he were walking directly into it. The corridor opened into a vast chamber filled with towering shelves and stone pedestals. Scrolls, tablets, and artifacts covered every surface, each one bearing the markings of the lost language. The walls were carved with depictions of Zelari figures, their arms raised toward the stars, their bodies entwined with strange patterns. Liara approached a pedestal at the center of the chamber. Resting upon it was a single, weathered book bound in material that did not resemble anything Elias had ever seen. Its pages were lined with text that he could almost recognize. This is the oldest record we possess, Liara said softly. It was written before our people settled on this world. It is said to hold the words of those who came before us. None have been able to read it. Elias hesitated, then stepped closer. His fingers brushed the edge of the book. The moment he touched it, a strange sensation passed through him. A feeling like a whisper at the edge of his mind, a voice just beyond his comprehension. He opened the book and looked at the first page. His breath caught in his throat. He could read it. Not all of it. Many of the words were unfamiliar, but there were enough connections for him to understand parts of it. The structure, the sentence patterns, the syntax. It was eerily close to an ancient human dialect. Liara watched him closely. What does it say? She asked. Elias exhaled slowly and ran his fingers over the text. It speaks of a journey, he murmured. A people who fled their dying home, who searched the stars for a new place to call their own. Liara's expression darkened. Then it is true, she whispered. Elias looked up at her. What is? She hesitated, then placed a hand on the book. There have always been stories among my people, she said, legends that our ancestors came from the sky, that we were not born on this world but placed here long ago. But those were only myths. Elias swallowed hard. The implications were staggering. If the Zelari were not native to this planet, then where had they come from? And more importantly, how was their language connected to one from Earth? Liara met his gaze, her silver eyes filled with something he couldn't quite define. We need to find out the truth, she said. Elias nodded. Whatever was happening, whatever strange connection existed between their species, he knew one thing for certain. The past was not what they had believed, and they were only beginning to uncover its secrets. Elias stared at the book in his hands, his mind struggling to process the significance of what he had just read. The Zalari were not native to this world. They had come from somewhere else, fleeing a catastrophe. He could not yet decipher the details, but the implication was clear. This civilization had not evolved here, it had migrated. But where had they come from? And how was their language so eerily close to an ancient human dialect? Liara stood beside him, her silver eyes locked onto the book, her expression unreadable. The chamber around them was silent, save for the faint crackling of the torches lining the walls. She was processing the same realization, but unlike him, she had grown up believing her people had always been here. If this record was true, then everything she had been taught was a carefully constructed illusion. She reached out, her fingers hovering just above the ancient pages as if she were afraid to touch them. "If this is real," she said softly, "then the elders must have known. There must be records beyond this book." Elias exhaled slowly. "If they do know, they've kept it hidden for a reason." Liara nodded. "And we need to find out why." She turned sharply and moved toward the far side of the chamber. Stone shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with scrolls, relics, and tablets covered in the same ancient script. She ran her fingers along the edges, scanning for anything that might provide answers. Elias joined her, his pulse quickening as he pulled a fragile-looking scroll from one of the lower shelves. Unrolling it carefully, he studied the markings. Some of the symbols were identical to those in the book, but there were additional annotations, written in a more recent form of the Zalari language. His eyes narrowed as he recognized several glyphs he had seen before. They were coordinates. His breath caught. "Liara, look at this." She turned immediately, leaning in as he pointed to the markings. "These symbols? This is a location." Her gaze darted between the scroll and the ancient book. "If this is what I think it is, then it could lead us to where our ancestors originally came from." Elias felt a chill run down his spine. "Or to whatever they were running from." Liara straightened. "Either way, we need to go there." A sharp voice cut through the chamber. "You will do no such thing." Elias turned quickly to see Viraj standing in the doorway, his expression hard, his silver eyes reflecting the torchlight. Two armed guards flanked him, their hands resting on the hilts of their ceremonial blades. Liara squared her shoulders, her bioluminescent markings pulsing with agitation. "You knew?" she accused. "You knew our people came from another world, and you hid it from us." Viraj's gaze remained steady. "What I know is that some truths must remain buried." Elias stepped forward. "Why? What are you afraid of?" Viraj studied him for a long moment before shifting his attention back to Liara. "You are young, and you do not understand the weight of history. Some knowledge does not bring enlightenment. It brings destruction." Liara clenched her fists. "You think ignorance is protection?" Viraj's expression darkened. "I think knowledge can be a curse." Elias could see the tension in the way Liara held herself. She was barely restraining her emotions. He had to tread carefully. "Viraj, we've already seen too much to turn back now," Elias said. "If there's something dangerous, then we need to know what it is." Viraj exhaled slowly. "You do not understand what you are asking." Liara's voice was sharp. "Then explain it to us." The elder was silent for a long moment. Then, without a word, he turned and motioned for them to follow. The guards remained where they were, but Elias could feel their eyes on him as he and Liara stepped forward. Viraj led them deeper into the vault, through a narrow passageway that descended into the earth. The air grew colder as they walked, the light of the torches casting elongated shadows against the rough stone walls. Finally, they emerged into another chamber, this one smaller, but filled with strange metallic objects that were unlike anything Elias had seen before. The walls were lined with what appeared to be storage containers, their surfaces engraved with markings even more ancient than those in the book. At the center of the room stood a pedestal. Upon it rested a single black tablet. Unlike the stone tablets in the previous chamber, this one was smooth, almost polished, its surface pulsing faintly with an unnatural glow. Varash gestured toward it. "This is the reason we do not seek our past." Elias stepped closer, his curiosity overriding his apprehension. The moment his fingers brushed the surface of the tablet, a jolt of energy shot through him. His vision blurred, and suddenly his mind was filled with fragmented images, a dying world, a sky torn apart by fire, towering structures collapsing as shadowy figures moved through the ruins, screams, the echoes of something vast and incomprehensible. He stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Liara caught his arm. "Elias, what did you see?" He shook his head, trying to steady himself. "A war," he managed. "A destruction so complete that nothing could survive it." Varash's expression was grim. "That was our home. And that is why we do not look back." Liara's voice was barely above a whisper. "What destroyed them?" Varash's eyes darkened. "We do not know, but we do know this. Whatever it was, it may still exist." Elias felt a chill crawl up his spine. If the thing that had wiped out the Zilari's ancestors was still out there, then searching for answers might be more dangerous than he had ever imagined. But something told him that the past was not finished with them yet. Elias stood motionless, his mind still reeling from the images that had flooded his consciousness the moment he touched the ancient black tablet. The weight of what he had seen pressed against him. Scenes of devastation, the annihilation of a civilization so advanced that its downfall should have been unthinkable. Fire and darkness had consumed their world, but the enemy remained unseen, a phantom lingering at the edges of history. Liara's grip on his arm tightened. He could feel the tension in her fingers, the barely restrained tremor in her hand. She had not seen the vision, but she had witnessed his reaction, and that was enough to fill her with dread. Her silver eyes searched his face, waiting for an explanation. "What did you see?" she asked again, her voice steady but strained. Elias exhaled slowly, trying to steady himself. "A war," he said, his voice rough, "or something worse. I saw cities collapsing, the sky burning, and something in the shadows, watching it all." Varash remained still, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his posture, something resigned. He had known this truth, or at least enough of it to understand the consequences of its revelation. Liara took a step closer to the pedestal, her gaze fixed on the tablet. "And you've kept this from us?" she demanded, her bioluminescent markings flaring brighter. "You let our people believe we were always here, that our past was nothing but myths and stories?" Varash's voice was calm but unyielding. "Would the truth have changed anything?" Liara turned sharply. "It would have changed everything." Elias placed a hand against his temple, forcing himself to focus. The vision had left him disoriented, but his mind was beginning to piece things together. If the Zilari's ancestors had fled from a destroyed world, then the question was not just what had destroyed them, but why. "Varash," Elias said, his voice more measured now, "you said you don't know what caused the destruction. But you suspect something, don't you?" The elder's expression darkened. He looked toward the tablet, then back at Elias. "We know only what the last survivors recorded before they fled. The warnings they left behind were vague, fragmented. They spoke of an enemy that did not come from the stars, but from something deeper." Liara frowned. "Deeper?" Varash hesitated. "The texts speak of a force that did not conquer, did not invade. It consumed, it erased, it did not leave ruins or bodies. It left only silence, and when our ancestors realized they could not fight it, They ran. Elias felt a cold sensation creep through his chest. And you think it might still be out there? Barash nodded once. It was never defeated. It was only escaped. Silence filled the chamber, heavy and suffocating. Liara's markings dimmed slightly as she processed the weight of the revelation. If that's true, she said quietly, then what happens if we aren't the only ones who remember? Elias turned toward her, realization settling over him. If our ancestors ran, what if something followed? The words hung between them, unspoken fears taking shape in the dim torchlight. Liara's fingers hovered above the tablet, hesitation clear in her posture. We need to know more. Varus shook his head. You have seen enough. She clenched her jaw. No. We've only seen what you wanted us to see. If we are truly in danger, then keeping us in ignorance will not save us. Elias stepped forward. There are coordinates in the records we found. If there's a chance they lead to more answers, then we need to follow them. Varash exhaled slowly, his gaze heavy with something between sorrow and frustration. If you leave this world searching for ghosts, you may not return. Elias met his stare. Then tell me, Varash, if what I saw was the truth, are we really safe staying here? For the first time, the elder did not have an answer. Liara turned to Elias, determination hardening her expression. We need to go. Elias nodded. Then let's find out what our ancestors were running from. As the chamber's torches flickered, casting long shadows against the ancient stone, a silent understanding passed between them. The past was no longer a mystery to be studied. It was a warning, and the time had come to face it. Elias gripped the metal railing as the shuttle's engines roared to life beneath him. The vibrations thrummed through his bones, the force pressing against his chest as the ship lifted from the jungle clearing, sending a storm of dust and broken leaves spiraling into the air. The ancient ruins below shrank rapidly from view, disappearing beneath the dense canopy of the Zolari homeworld. Liara sat beside him, her fingers tightly curled around the strap of her harness, her silver eyes fixed on the viewport as the sky beyond darkened into the endless abyss of space. The coordinates had been extracted from the scrolls and confirmed through additional records stored deep within the vault. The location, an uncharted sector of the galaxy, was far beyond any known trade routes or surveyed regions. It had no official designation, no recorded colonies, no signs of habitation. It was a void, silent, forgotten. Elias knew that meant one of two things. Either nothing remained or something had been left undisturbed for far too long. Liara finally turned from the viewport, her voice quiet but steady. Do you think we'll find anything there? Elias exhaled slowly, his fingers drumming against his knee as he considered her question. I don't know what we'll find, but if our ancestors left something behind, anything, we need to understand what it means. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. I don't think Viraj wanted to hide the truth out of fear alone, she said. I think he believed that if we never searched, we would never be found. Elias met her gaze. But if something is still out there, ignoring it won't make it disappear. The shuttle's guidance system signaled their transition into faster-than-light travel, the external panels shifting as the ship's engines activated the quantum drive. A deep hum filled the cabin, and within seconds, the stars outside elongated into streaks of light, stretching infinitely in every direction. The ship hurled forward, cutting through the void toward a destination untouched for millennia. The journey was not long by interstellar standards, but the weight of it stretched time in a way that made every moment feel unbearable. Elias occupied himself by reviewing the limited data they had gathered from the Zolari archives. The last known entry from their ancestors' records indicated a mass exodus, a desperate escape from something beyond comprehension. The details were fragmented, filled with warnings but lacking clear descriptions. No names, no images, only vague references to the silent end and the return to dust. Liara remained mostly quiet, her thoughts locked behind the tension in her posture. She had spent her entire life believing in the version of history the elders had provided. Now she was confronting the truth, that her people had been running from something so terrible that even the memory of it had been deliberately erased. When the ship's alarm signaled their approach, Elias leaned forward, eyes narrowing as he read the external scan reports. There was something in the void, not a planet, not a star system, something artificial. The ship disengaged its quantum drive, reality snapping back into clarity as the surrounding darkness settled into place. And then, there it was, a structure, enormous, silent, floating in the blackness of space. Liara let out a sharp breath. "What is that?" Elias shook his head. "I don't know." The structure was vast, larger than any known space station, its dark metallic surface covered in patterns eerily similar to the inscriptions in the vault. But it was lifeless. No lights, no energy signatures, just a dead relic drifting through the void. He activated the ship's scanners, trying to get a deeper reading, but the results made no sense. The station's material composition did not match any known metals or alloys. It was ancient, beyond reckoning, yet structurally intact. No decay, no breaches. It was as if it had been frozen in time. Liara glanced at him. "Do we dock?" Elias hesitated, but he already knew the answer. "We came this far. We need to see what's inside." The ship's automated docking system engaged, sending out a connection beam that latched onto the station's external port. The docking clamp secured with a dull thud, followed by a hiss as the airlock equalized pressure. A moment later, the door slid open. Elias stepped inside first, his boots echoing against the smooth metallic floor. The corridor stretched ahead, dimly illuminated by an unknown light source, a faint luminescence embedded in the very walls. The air was stale but breathable. Liara followed close behind, her fingers hovering near the pulse weapon strapped to her hip. "This place feels wrong," she murmured. Elias nodded. "It's not abandoned. It's waiting." They moved cautiously, the corridor widening into a vast chamber, and at the center, a terminal. It was unlike anything Elias had ever seen, its design intricate, covered in ancient glyphs that pulsed faintly as they approached. Liara hesitated. "Can you read it?" Elias stepped closer, scanning the inscriptions. The symbols were similar to the texts in the vault, but there were new variations, deeper meanings layered within them. His mind worked through the structure, recognizing patterns, reconstructing phrases. His breath caught. "It's a warning." Liara's pulse quickened. "What does it say?" Elias swallowed hard. "It says, 'The silence is not death, it is sleep, and the sleepers will wake when the last of us remembers.'" The moment the words left his mouth, the station trembled. The lights brightened, and a deep, resonant hum filled the chamber. Liara's eyes widened. "What did you do?" Elias turned sharply, his pulse hammering in his ears. I think I just woke something up." A deep groan echoed through the structure, reverberating through the walls, as if the entire station had been dormant and was now stirring from its slumber. Then, far down the corridor, something moved. Liara reached for her weapon. "We need to get out of here." Elias's fingers clenched around the console. "No. We need to know what's waking up." A shape emerged from the shadows. Not metal, not flesh, something else. Something that had not walked for millennia. Liara's breath caught in her throat. "Elias?" The figure stepped forward, and for the first time Elias saw its face. It was not Zalari. It was not human. It was something in between, and when it opened its mouth, it did not speak. It whispered. A voice older than the stars, a voice that had been waiting, and as it spoke, Elias understood. The past had never been lost. It had been waiting to be found.